Lena Anderson always prided herself on being organized, especially on busy mornings like this one. The town of Maplewood was small, but even a simple trip into town could turn chaotic if she didn't stick to her plan. Her list was precise: the bank to deposit a check, the post office to mail a package for her sister, a quick stop at the market for fresh bread, and finally, a visit to her cousin Clara on Elm Street. Clara had been on her mind more often lately. It was just over a week since Clara's husband, Evan, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The shock had rippled through the family, and Lena had felt the weight of it deeply. Evan had been like an older brother to her growing up, always teasing her at family gatherings or slipping her a few extra dollars when she was saving for her first car. But his loss wasn't just personal. It was devastating for Clara. Despite her intention to visit Clara earlier, life had pulled Lena in a dozen different directions. A leaking faucet at home, her son's school project, and a demanding work week had kept her distracted. But today was finally the day. Clara was the last stop on her list because Lena wanted to give her full attention without worrying about unfinished errands. The drive into town was peaceful. The sun was shining brightly through the trees lining the road, their golden leaves shimmering in the gentle autumn breeze. Lena's favorite playlist hummed softly from the car speakers as she mentally reviewed her plan. Bank first, she thought aloud, her voice filling the car as she reached for the notebook beside her. Then the post office. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. Oh, and don't forget to ask about those new stamps Margaret mentioned. She'd love a set for her collection. She glanced at the small package wrapped neatly in brown paper on the passenger seat. It was a gift for her sister, Lucy, who lived across the state. Inside was a delicate bracelet Lena had picked out during her last trip to the city. Lucy had always loved jewelry, and Lena could already imagine the joy on her sister's face when she opened it. The market was next on her mental checklist. Lena's favorite bakery had just started making a rosemary sourdough bread that was quickly becoming a family favorite. She could almost taste it already, toasted with a bit of butter and honey. Finally, there was Clara. The thought of her cousin tugged at Lena's heart. She couldn't imagine the depth of the grief Clara must be feeling. Evan and Clara had been inseparable since they first met in college, their love story one of those rare, golden ones that seemed to shine brighter with each passing year. Evan had been Clara's rock, her laughter, her everything. And now, Clara was alone. "I'll bring her flowers," Lena mused, her hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. Something cheerful. Daisies, maybe. She always loved daisies. As she approached the first stop sign at the edge of town, Lena slowed the car, glancing at the road ahead. The bank was just a few blocks down to the right. She started planning the quickest way to the post office from there, calculating which streets would have the least traffic this time of morning. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. It wasn't her voice, not the usual inner monologue that accompanied her decision-making. It was melodic, clear, and calm, yet undeniably distinct. Why not visit Clara now? Lena froze, her foot hovering over the gas pedal. She glanced around instinctively, as though expecting to see someone standing beside the car. The street was empty except for a man jogging with his golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk. The voice repeated in her mind, softer now, but still firm. Why not visit Clara now? Her heart began to race. Was she imagining things? She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard something so specific. Now, Lena whispered aloud, her brow furrowing. It didn't make sense. She had a plan. The bank first, then the post office. Everything would flow smoothly that way. But the voice seemed to nudge her, as if waiting for her to act. The light ahead changed to green, and Lena's car crept forward almost on autopilot. She glanced at the left turn lane. It would take her directly toward Clara's house. For a moment, she hesitated, the steering wheel cool beneath her hands. This is ridiculous, she thought, shaking her head. But as the seconds ticked by, a strange calmness began to settle over her. The voice didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like guidance, as though someone, or something, knew better than she did. The decision was made before she could overthink it further. Flipping on her blinker, Lena eased into the left turn lane just as the green arrow lit up. The drive to Clara's house was short, just a few blocks through quiet neighborhoods lined with neatly trimmed hedges and maple trees shedding their leaves. But as Lena drove, her mind buzzed with questions. What was that voice? Why did it feel so urgent? Part of her was worried Clara wouldn't even be home. What if she'd gone out for some fresh air? Or if a friend had already stopped by? Would Lena's unplanned visit seem intrusive? But the voice had been so clear, so certain. Lena couldn't ignore it. As she turned onto Elm Street, Clara's house came into view. It was a modest, gray brick bungalow with blue shutters and a small porch where Evan had loved to sit and read. Today, the shutters were closed and the porch was empty. Lena pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. She took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel as she tried to steady herself. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's see if this voice was right." Grabbing her purse, she stepped out of the car, the cool autumn air brushing against her cheeks. The crunch of leaves underfoot seemed louder in the stillness as she approached the front door. Knocking lightly, she waited, her heart pounding. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes before the door creaked open. Clara stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. "Oh, Lena," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. In that moment, Lena knew the voice had been right. Clara needed her, and she'd arrived just in time. Lena couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. The voice still echoed in her mind, calm and steady. Why not visit Clara now? It wasn't loud or forceful, but it had been impossible to ignore. She tried to rationalize it as some strange figment of her imagination or a fleeting thought disguised as intuition. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. As she drove toward Clara's house, her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, a stark contrast to her racing thoughts. The air inside felt heavier somehow, as though it carried the significance of this detour. What if I hadn't listened, she wondered. What if I brushed it off and went to the bank instead? But here she was, winding her way through the familiar streets of Maplewood, heading to Clara's bungalow on Elm Street. The houses she passed seemed to blur together, each one blending into the next. The sight of tidy front porches, freshly raked leaves, and the occasional Halloween decoration failed to soothe her. She was too preoccupied by the strange urgency that had gripped her the moment she turned left instead of continuing straight. The light breeze from her slightly open window carried the scent of autumn, damp earth, fallen leaves, and the faint aroma of wood smoke. Normally, Lena found the smell comforting, but today it barely registered. Her focus was locked on the road ahead, and her heart thudded against her ribs. Clara's house came into view, its familiar gray brick exterior looking even more somber than usual. The blue shutters were closed tightly, and the small porch, once lively with potted plants and seasonal decorations, stood bare. Evan used to sit there, sipping coffee in the mornings or reading the paper in the afternoons. It was strange to see it so empty. Lena parked in the driveway and shut off the engine. The stillness around her was almost deafening, and for a moment, she hesitated. What am I even going to say to her? She muttered under her breath. She'd visited Clara briefly after Evan's funeral, but that was different. The family had been around, and there were tasks to focus on. Flowers to arrange, food to organize, guests to greet. Now, it was just the two of them, and Lena felt a lump forming in her throat. Stop overthinking it, she told herself. Just go. Grabbing her purse, Lena stepped out of the car and made her way to the front door. The crunch of leaves underfoot seemed unnaturally loud, each step echoing in her ears. When she reached the door, she hesitated again, her hand hovering over the brass knocker. Finally, she rapped lightly, the sound barely carrying through the heavy door. She waited, her heart pounding. The door creaked open, and there stood Clara. At first glance, Clara looked like a ghost of her former self. Her usually well-kept appearance was disheveled. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she wore a loose sweater that hung limply on her thin frame. But it was her eyes that struck Lena the most. They were swollen and bloodshot, hollowed out by days of grief and sleepless nights. "Lena," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse as though she hadn't spoken in hours. Without thinking, Lena stepped forward and pulled Clara into a tight embrace. For a moment, Clara stood stiffly, as if unsure how to react, but then she melted into Lena's arms. "Oh, Lena," Clara murmured, her voice breaking as tears began to flow. Chill," Lena said softly, holding her cousin closer. "You don't have to say anything. I'm here." Clara guided Lena into the living room, where the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The shades were drawn, and the only light came from a small lamp in the corner. The coffee table was cluttered with tissues, an empty mug, and a half-eaten sandwich that looked like it had been sitting there for hours. Lena took a seat on the couch beside Clara, who immediately curled up, hugging her knees to her chest. "I wasn't expecting anyone," Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. I haven't been able to face people lately." "I understand," Lena said gently. "But I'm not here to intrude or expect anything from you. I felt like I needed to come." Clara glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her exhaustion. "Why did I? I mean, it's not like I told anyone I needed company." Lena hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding strange. But Clara deserved the truth. "I don't know how to explain this," Lena began, "but I was running errands, and I had a plan. You were supposed to be my last stop. Then, at the first stop sign, I heard this voice." Clara's brow furrowed slightly. "A voice?" Lena nodded, her gaze steady. It was clear and calm, almost beautiful. "It told me to come to you now, not later." I wasn't going to listen at first, but something about it felt so urgent. Like I had to drop everything and come. For a long moment, Clara didn't respond. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on a spot just above Lena's shoulder. Then, to Lena's surprise, Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Maybe it was Evan," she said softly. Lena blinked, startled. "You think so?" Clara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He always had this way of knowing when I needed someone, even when I didn't say it out loud. If anyone could send you a message like that, it would be him." The two women sat together in silence for a while, the weight of grief hanging in the air. Lena didn't press Clara to talk or ask questions. Instead, she simply stayed close, offering her presence as a quiet comfort. Eventually, Clara began to open up. She spoke about Evan, how much she missed his laugh, his silly jokes, the way he used to sing off-key while making breakfast. She shared her fears about facing the future without him and her guilt for not being able to move on as quickly as she thought she should. Lena listened, her heart breaking for her cousin. She didn't have any magic words to make the pain go away, but she knew that sometimes just being there was enough. When Clara paused, Lena reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to rush this," she said gently. "Grief doesn't have a timeline. You take all the time you need, and I'll be here every step of the way." Clara smiled through her tears, her grip on Lena's hand tightening. "Thank you," she whispered. By the time Lena left, the atmosphere in the house felt lighter. Clara wasn't healed, but she seemed less burdened, her posture less slumped, her voice less shaky. As Lena drove away, she couldn't help but marvel at the series of events that had led her there. The voice, the turn, the timing, it was all too perfect to be a coincidence. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a deep sense of peace. Lena stayed with Clara longer than she anticipated. The detour had thrown her schedule into disarray, but she didn't mind. Watching Clara pour out her grief, Lena understood why she'd been called here. This wasn't a social visit or a matter of timing. It was about being present, about offering her cousin the one thing she seemed to need most: someone to simply listen. After their quiet conversation in the living room, Clara stood and moved toward the kitchen. Lena noticed her cousin's hands trembling as she reached for the kettle. "Let me do that," Lena offered, rising to her feet. Clara hesitated but finally nodded, her shoulders sagging. Lena took over, filling the kettle and placing it on the stove. She searched the cabinets until she found a box of chamomile tea, then set out 2 mugs on the counter. I haven't had tea since, Clara trailed off, her voice cracking. You don't have to finish that, Lena said gently. But Clara shook her head. No, I do. Since the night Evan passed. We used to sit here every evening and drink tea. It was our little ritual. Lena placed a hand on her cousin's arm, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't pull away. As the water boiled, Clara began to talk again, her voice unsteady at first. She spoke in fragments, as though the full weight of her loss was too much to articulate all at once. I keep expecting to hear his laugh, Clara said, staring down at the floor. He used to laugh at the dumbest things, like when the cat knocked something off the counter, or when we watched those ridiculous cooking shows where the contestants always burned their cakes. I keep thinking I'll walk into the room and hear him laughing, but it's just quiet. Lena didn't interrupt. She simply leaned against the counter, giving Clara the space to say what she needed. And the nights, Clara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The nights are the worst. I can't sleep in our bed anymore. It feels wrong, so I've been on the couch. But even then, I wake up every hour, and the silence is unbearable. Tears streamed down Clara's face now, unchecked. She pressed the sleeve of her sweater to her eyes, trying to wipe them away, but they kept coming. I don't know how to do this, Lena, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to live without him. The kettle whistled, breaking the tension in the room. Lena moved quickly to pour the steaming water into the mugs, handing one to Clara before leading her back to the couch. You don't have to know how to do this, Lena said softly once they were seated. There's no manual for grief, Clara. You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask of you. Clara sniffled, her hands cradling the warm mug. I feel like I'm failing, like I'm letting him down by not being stronger. No, Lena said firmly, shaking her head. You're not failing. Grief isn't about strength or weakness. It's about love. You loved Evan deeply, and losing him hurts because that love is still there. It always will be, but that doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She stared into her tea as though searching for answers in the swirling steam. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, steadier. Do you ever feel like you're being watched over? She asked hesitantly. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Since Evan passed, I've felt this presence, Clara admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. Not all the time, but in little moments, like when I find something of his I thought was lost, or when I hear a song he loved on the radio at just the right time. It's like he's still here, somehow, watching out for me. Lena nodded slowly, her mind drifting back to the voice she'd heard earlier that morning. I think he is, she said. And I think that's why I'm here today. Clara tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her tired eyes. What do you mean? Lena hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding strange. But this wasn't the time for half-truths. Clara needed to hear the full story. I wasn't supposed to come here first, Lena began. I had errands to run, bank, post office, the works. You were my last stop because I wanted to have everything else done before I visited. But when I got to the first stop sign, I heard this voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It told me to come to you now, not later. Clara stared at her, her expression a mix of wonder and disbelief. At first, I thought I was imagining it, Lena continued. But the feeling was so strong, I couldn't ignore it. So I turned left instead of going straight. And here I am. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she let Lena's words sink in. You think that was Evan? I don't know for sure, Lena admitted. But I think someone knew you needed me today. Whether it was Evan, an angel, or God himself, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I listened, and I'm here. Clara set her mug down on the coffee table and leaned back against the couch cushions. Her gaze drifted toward the ceiling, her lips moving silently, as though she were saying a prayer. For the next few hours, the cousins talked. Clara opened up about her memories of Evan, the good times and the hard times, the little quirks and habits that made him who he was. Lena listened attentively, offering comfort where she could, but mostly just being there. They laughed at the story of Evan's failed attempt to surprise Clara with a homemade anniversary dinner, a fiasco that ended with burnt lasagna and takeout pizza. They cried when Clara described the day Evan proposed, kneeling in the snow with frozen fingers because he couldn't wait for spring. By the time the conversation wound down, the room felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Clara still carried her grief, but she no longer seemed so crushed by it. "You've helped me more than you know," Clara said quietly as Lena prepared to leave. "You've helped me too," Lena replied. Clara frowned. "How?" "You reminded me that love doesn't end," Lena said. "It changes, but it's still there. Evan's love for you is still here, Clara. And so is mine." As Lena walked back to her car, the air felt different. The heaviness she'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She didn't know if the voice she'd heard that morning was Evan, an angel, or something else entirely, but she was certain of one thing. She'd been exactly where she was meant to be. Lena couldn't stop thinking about the timing of everything. As she drove home from Clara's house, the day's events replayed in her mind like scenes from a movie. She had always believed in divine intervention in theory, but this felt different. Immediate, personal, undeniable. The voice had come at just the right moment. If it hadn't, she might have arrived at Clara's house hours later, perhaps after her cousin had already crumbled under the weight of her emotions. Clara might not have opened up the way she did. And as much as Lena wanted to chalk it up to coincidence, she knew better. As the road curved ahead, sunlight poured through the trees in golden streams, casting long shadows across the pavement. Lena rolled down the window, letting the crisp autumn air fill the car. It carried a sense of renewal, as if the world itself was whispering reassurance. When she reached home, the familiar sight of her cozy bungalow welcomed her. The white picket fence and potted mums on the porch were symbols of stability, but today they also felt like a reminder of her own blessings. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Her thoughts drifted back to Clara. The pain in her cousin's eyes had been profound, almost too much to bear, and Lena felt a pang of guilt for not visiting sooner. She had told herself she was too busy, that there were too many other things demanding her attention. But was that really true? Lena shook her head. "No more excuses," she murmured to herself. She stepped out of the car and made her way inside. The house was quiet. Her husband, Greg, wouldn't be home from work for another hour, and their teenage son, Max, was still at soccer practice. For once, she had the space to think without interruptions. After putting on the kettle for tea, Lena settled in her favorite armchair by the window. The light from the setting sun bathed the room in a warm glow, and she pulled a blanket over her lap. She thought again about the voice. It had been so clear, so deliberate, like someone sitting beside her and speaking directly into her heart. But the most remarkable thing was how calm it had made her feel. At the time, she hadn't even questioned it. It had simply felt right. Was it Evan? Lena wasn't sure. Clara seemed to think so, and it was a comforting thought. Evan had always been deeply intuitive, the kind of person who noticed when someone was struggling even before they said a word. Maybe that intuition had transcended even death, reaching out to guide Lena when she needed it most. But another possibility tugged at her mind. Could it have been an angel? Lena had always believed in guardian angels, though her faith in them had wavered over the years. Life had a way of making you doubt what you couldn't see. But today had felt like proof that there was something greater at work, something watching over all of them. The kettle whistled, pulling Lena from her thoughts. She poured herself a cup of tea and returned to her chair, cradling the warm mug in her hands. The aroma of chamomile filled the room, soothing her as she considered the events of the day. Lena thought about the timing of the light at the intersection. It had changed just as she approached, almost as though the universe had cleared the way for her to make the left turn. If she'd arrived even a few seconds later, she might have hesitated, stuck in indecision. She thought about Clara's state when she arrived. It was clear that her cousin had been barely holding it together, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Would she have opened up in the same way if Lena had come later, after she'd bottled up her emotions again? Everything had aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Later that evening, Lena shared the story with Greg over dinner. "So, let me get this straight," Greg said, leaning back in his chair. "You heard a voice telling you to go to Clara's house instead of running your errands?" "Yes," Lena replied, her tone resolute. "I know it sounds crazy, but I can't explain it any other way. It wasn't my voice, and it wasn't just a random thought. It felt guided." Greg studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. "And you think it was what?" "An angel." "Maybe," Lena said, setting her fork down. "Or maybe it was Evan. Clara thinks it could have been him." Greg's expression softened. "Well, whoever or whatever it sounds like you made the right call. Clara needed you. That's what I keep coming back to," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "The timing was perfect. If I hadn't listened, who knows what would have happened?" Greg reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm proud of you," he said, "for listening, for being there for her." Lena smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I just hope I can keep listening. If there are angels watching over us, I don't want to miss their guidance." That night, as Lena lay in bed, she found herself unable to sleep. The house was dark and quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. She stared at the ceiling, her mind still buzzing with questions. What if she hadn't heard the voice? What if she had ignored it, brushing it off as her imagination? The thought sent a chill through her. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for showing me where I needed to be." It wasn't much, but it was all she could offer. The simplest expression of gratitude for the unseen force that had guided her. In the days that followed, Lena noticed herself paying more attention to the world around her. Little things she might have ignored before. A kind word from a stranger, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, took on new meaning. She felt more attuned to the subtle ways life seemed to communicate with her, as though the voice she'd heard had opened a door to something greater. When she visited Clara again a few days later, her cousin seemed lighter. The sadness was still there, but so was a spark of hope. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara told her as they sipped tea in the kitchen. "About angels. About Evan. And I realized maybe he's not really gone. Not completely." Lena reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "I think you're right," she said. "And I think he wants you to know you're not alone." Clara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for listening to that voice, Lena. Thank you for coming when I needed you most." Lena squeezed her cousin's hand, her heart full. "Thank the angel," she said softly. "I was just following orders." The days following her visit to Clara's house stayed with Lena like an unshakable melody. She couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just in Clara, but in herself as well. Their connection had always been strong, built on years of shared childhood memories and countless family gatherings. But that day, sitting together in Clara's living room as grief poured out in unfiltered waves, something deeper had taken root. Lena had always thought of herself as a good listener, but this felt different. She hadn't just heard Clara's words. She'd absorbed them, carried them as if they were her own. And perhaps, in a way, they were. The connection they shared now wasn't simply about family. It was about being present in life's hardest moments, when words felt insufficient, but staying silent felt unbearable. Lena decided to visit Clara again just a few days after their first encounter. This time, she wasn't responding to a mysterious voice or a sudden sense of urgency. She simply felt drawn to her cousin, as though her presence was part of the healing process they both needed. She stopped by the market on her way, picking up a loaf of Clara's favorite sourdough bread and a bouquet of daisies. Clara had always loved daisies for their simplicity and cheerfulness. When Lena knocked on the door, Clara answered more quickly this time. Her appearance had improved, albeit subtly. Her hair was brushed, and her sweater seemed freshly laundered. Though her eyes still carried the weight of grief, there was a faint flicker of life in them that had been absent before. "Lena," Clara said, her voice softer than usual but warm. I wasn't expecting you. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing, Lena said, holding up the flowers and bread. And I brought a few things. Clara smiled, a small but genuine expression that made Lena's heart swell. Mean. I was just about to make tea. The house was tidier than before. The coffee table had been cleared of tissues, and the couch cushions were fluffed and neatly arranged. A candle burned on the mantel, filling the room with a faint scent of lavender. You've been busy, Lena remarked, setting the bread and flowers on the kitchen counter. Clara shrugged. I had a good day yesterday. Thought I'd take advantage of it while it lasted. Lena nodded, understanding the delicate balance Clara was navigating. Grief wasn't a straight path. It was a winding road with unexpected turns, some leading to moments of clarity and others plunging into darkness. As they settled into the kitchen with steaming mugs of tea, Clara seemed more at ease than she had been during Lena's first visit. She even managed a laugh when Lena recounted a story about Max accidentally dyeing his hair green for a school spirit event. He said he was going for subtle streaks, Lena said, rolling her eyes. Instead, he ended up looking like a leprechaun. It's going to take weeks to fade. Clara chuckled, shaking her head. That boy always did have a flair for the dramatic. The laughter was brief but genuine, a small break in the clouds that had hovered over Clara since Evan's passing. As the conversation shifted, Clara began to open up about Evan again. You know, Clara said, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger, he always believed in angels. He didn't talk about it much, but every now and then, he'd say something that made me think he really felt their presence. Lena tilted her head, intrigued. What kind of things would he say? Clara smiled wistfully. Little things mostly, like when we found a parking spot right when we needed one, or when a solution to a problem seemed to come out of nowhere. He'd always say, "That's an angel watching out for us." That sounds like Evan, Lena said, her chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and warmth. Clara nodded, her gaze distant. I used to tease him about it, tell him he was too old to believe in things like that. But now I wonder if he was onto something. Lena hesitated, then decided to share a thought that had been lingering in her mind. Do you think maybe that's why I heard the voice? Because Evan believed so strongly in angels. Clara's eyes met hers, a glimmer of something unspoken passing between them. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe it's because something knew you'd listen. The conversation took a quieter turn after that, both women lost in their thoughts. Lena wondered about the nature of faith and intuition, how sometimes the smallest moments could carry the greatest significance. She thought about the voice she'd heard at the stop sign, how it had nudged her onto a different path. What if she hadn't listened? What if she dismissed it as her imagination? The thought made her shudder. Lena, Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. I want you to know how much it means to me that you came when you did. Lena looked up, surprised by the intensity in Clara's voice. I was in a bad place that morning, Clara admitted. Worse than I let on. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up when you did. The weight of Clara's words hit Lena like a tidal wave. She reached across the table and took Clara's hand. You don't have to go through this alone, Lena said firmly. I'm here, for as long as you need me. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they didn't seem as heavy. Thank you, she whispered. The rest of the visit passed in comfortable companionship. They prepared a simple lunch together, slicing the sourdough bread and pairing it with cheese and fruit. Clara even shared a few stories about her childhood, moments Lena had never heard before. When it was time for Lena to leave, Clara walked her to the door. Come back soon, Clara said, her voice steady. I will, Lena promised. As Lena stepped outside, the crisp autumn air greeted her, carrying with it the faint scent of falling leaves. She glanced back at Clara, who stood in the doorway, watching her go. For the first time in weeks, Clara looked like herself again, not entirely whole, but no longer shattered. Driving home, Lena felt a profound sense of gratitude. The bond she shared with Clara had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. And though the pain of loss still lingered, it was now tempered by a quiet understanding that they weren't navigating this journey alone. The voice Lena had heard at the stop sign was more than a guiding whisper. It was a reminder of the connections that held them together, the unseen forces that moved them to act when it mattered most. "Thank you," Lena whispered as she drove, her voice carrying into the stillness of the car. "Thank you for showing me the way." The days turned into weeks, and though Clara's grief was still present, it no longer consumed her. Lena made a point to visit her cousin regularly, and each time, she noticed subtle signs of healing. Clara started sitting on the porch again, sipping tea and watching the world pass by. The daisies Lena had brought were moved to a vase in the living room, their cheerful presence a quiet testament to resilience. For Lena, the experience had been transformative. The mysterious voice she'd heard at the stop sign that day had opened her eyes to something far greater than her daily routines or carefully laid plans. It had revealed to her the intricate ways life's invisible threads connected people, guiding them toward the moments and places where they were needed most. On a brisk November morning, Lena found herself reflecting on it all. The sun had risen early, casting a golden glow over the frost-covered lawn. Sitting by the window with her cup of coffee, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for her family or the blessings in her life, but for the unseen presence that had nudged her when she needed it most. She thought back to the voice, clear and melodic, that had spoken to her so plainly that morning. It hadn't just changed her plans, it had changed her perspective. Why not visit Clara now? The words echoed in her mind, and Lena smiled. It wasn't a question. It had been a directive, one she hadn't questioned or resisted. It was as though her guardian angel, or perhaps Evan's spirit, had known precisely what was needed. Later that day, as Lena tidied up the house, she stumbled upon an old journal tucked away in the back of a cabinet. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were slightly yellowed, but it brought back a flood of memories. The journal had been a gift from her grandmother years ago, back when Lena was a teenager navigating the complexities of growing up. Inside, she'd written sporadically, jotting down her thoughts, fears, and dreams whenever the mood struck. Flipping through the pages, Lena found an entry from nearly 20 years earlier. The handwriting was her own, but younger, less steady. "Today, I prayed for guidance. I don't know if angels are real, but if they are, I hope one is watching over me." Lena paused, her breath catching. She had no memory of writing those words, but they felt eerily relevant now. Closing the journal, she held it against her chest, a sense of peace washing over her. Maybe her prayer from all those years ago had been answered in ways she couldn't have imagined. The following weekend, Lena invited Clara to her house for dinner. It was a small affair, just the two of them, Greg and Max, but it felt like a step forward. Clara hadn't been out much since Evan's passing, and Lena wanted her to feel a sense of normalcy again. Clara arrived with a homemade apple pie, a recipe she and Evan had perfected together. As they sat around the dining table, the atmosphere was warm and lively. Max regaled everyone with stories about his soccer team, and Greg shared a few jokes that had Clara laughing harder than Lena had seen in weeks. After dinner, as the candles burned low and the conversation quieted, Clara turned to Lena. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Clara began, her voice steady. "About what?" Lena asked. "About angels," Clara replied, "and about how sometimes they work through us. I felt that a lot lately, like Evan is still here, guiding me, reminding me to keep going." Lena reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. "I think he is," she said, "and I think you're stronger than you realize." The conversation stayed with Lena long after the evening ended. That night, as she lay in bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting once again to the mysterious events of that fateful day. She thought about the timing, the perfect sequence of moments that had led her to Clara's doorstep just when her cousin needed her most. She thought about the voice, calm and insistent, that had pierced through the noise of her thoughts and pointed her in the right direction. "Thank you," Lena whispered into the quiet darkness. In the months that followed, Lena's relationship with Clara grew stronger than ever. They developed new rituals, Weekly walks in the park, quiet afternoons spent baking, and long conversations that often turned to memories of Evan. Clara began to smile more, laugh more, and even talk about the future. But it wasn't just Clara who changed. Lena felt a profound shift within herself. She became more attuned to the quiet nudges and whispers of intuition, the subtle ways the universe seemed to speak. One morning, as she drove into town, she caught herself glancing at the stop sign where she'd first heard the voice. She slowed the car, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for sending me," she murmured. Lena began to see signs of divine guidance everywhere, not in grand gestures, but in the little things. The way a stranger's kind words brightened her day. The way a problem seemed to resolve itself just when she needed it most. The way the sun broke through the clouds after days of rain, casting a golden light over everything. Each moment felt like a reminder that she wasn't alone, that something greater was watching over her and the people she loved. One crisp afternoon in early spring, Lena and Clara visited the cemetery where Evan was buried. The grass was vibrant and green, dotted with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. Clara knelt by Evan's headstone, placing a bouquet of fresh daisies at its base. She sat there for a while, her head bowed in quiet reflection, while Lena stood a few steps away, giving her cousin the space she needed. When Clara finally rose, she turned to Lena with a serene smile. "I feel him here," Clara said softly. "But I also feel him everywhere, in the house, in the garden, even when I'm just sitting quietly with my thoughts. He's still with me." Lena nodded, her heart full. "And he always will be." As they walked back to the car, Clara slipped her arm through Lena's. "Thank you for being my angel," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Lena shook her head. "I wasn't the angel," she replied. "I was just lucky enough to hear one." That night, as Lena sat by her window, watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky, she felt a profound sense of peace. Life was unpredictable, often filled with pain and loss, but it was also filled with moments of beauty and connection. And in those moments, Lena knew angels were always watching.